Hey guys, I'm Matt Lighty, and this video is a fun little interesting thing that I did on the side just because I was curious what the boss unique usage over time was for 3.24, given we just had a major shakeup of the regular loot tables for bossing, the Ubers, and the Uber fragment distribution system. So what I've done here is I've made a little Google sheet that has the drop rates of all the uniques off of the regular and the Uber variations of bosses, and the amount of players using those uniques at week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're in the middle of week 6 right now, so I didn't figure I wouldn't chart that. And this is in softcore trades. By far the most people play softcore trade. That's where I chart this in. So this is pretty simple. So for example, in Venarius, which is Cortex, offering of the Serpent, right? That's these gloves. Not very good, and it is reflected here. It's a 45% chance to drop off of the boss, which is a bummer, because barely anyone's using them. And they're also worthless. So that's something we could check as well, is costs. Fun to just like denote this sort of information, in my opinion, because it's interesting because a lot of these things were changed and split, and it's like some of the changes were very appropriate and kind of respectful of the uniques and make sense considering the usage, and other ones are totally cracked out. So realistically, all these drops are pretty okay. People are using them. If any unique is really not in the hundreds for the common drops and in the thousands for the rarest drops, in my opinion, that's totally fucked, because the most expensive thing and the best thing should be the thing that's the rarest off the boss. Otherwise, why is it rare if no one's using it and it costs nothing? That to me is not a great leap in logic. Now, these numbers are all accurate, but it tells a very incomplete picture. However, you can still glean some interesting perspectives from it. So, Bottled Faith is the 2% drop off of Cortex. In relation to its price, it's at the moment 16 div, and that is, it will go up and down from week 1 to week 15 because there's rolls, etc., and just values and prices, but it is being used by a large swath of players. Now, to note, this is being taken off of a sample size of about 100,000 players in the top end of Path of Exile's trade softcore, but that's the idea of where this is coming from. So, 7,700 of those 100,000 people are using Bottled Faith at week 5. And it's a very valuable unique price-wise, and it's rare, and it's good. That's perfect. That's what you'd want to see. You'd want to see the 2% drop being used by a bunch of people, and it's expensive, meaning this thing's good, this thing has value, right? It's worth doing Cortex, because if you get a Bottled Faith, that could be upwards of 20 div in your bank, right? Fantastic. And if you don't get a Bottled Faith, these things might not be worth a lot, but because some people are using them, depending on the synthesis implicit, since it's a Cortex, or synthesis map, or it has it can corrupt it, there could be some value to be gleaned there. Let's go to the Uber variation, because this tells a different tale. So the Uber variation has 2 drops, Mask of the Tribunal and Nebulous, that were taken off of the regular version and just slapped on the Uber version. Okay, Garb was then taken from Uber and put on the regular version. This was a change, whether it's a good or change or bad change, hard to say. People are still using them. I mean, obviously they're using ones that have either good corruptions or good synth implicits, but they're being used. All of the Uber Cortex uniques are being used. Now, they're not all expensive, and depending on the roles, they might not be super useful, but they're all being used. None of them are like truly atrocious numbers. So I think that's rarely, for the most part, very healthy. Rational Doctrine, being the rarest drop, is being used by a large number of players, and it has good value, like in multiple divines. So again, that feels like it's kind of mission success from a trade league perspective and from a use case perspective, right? If the, as you go down the list from the most common to the least common, in a way it should go up in the use case as you go farther on a league, right? Because in the very beginning of the league, like it shows here, not many people can have them or afford them. As you progress the league, more people can get them because more people can do the content or just afford buying them. And then in a way, a lot of these uniques will tell almost an inverse story, or they'll plateau, right? So like Offering of Serpents, like people have them, and then the people that were using them in week 3 are the same people using them in week 5 because they're not very good, And we'll see some as we go down this list. So Maven's a very interesting tale. Again, you could see that, look at all of these uniques, right? The ones that are being used here from week 1 to week 5, similar use number, right? Meaning it goes up a little bit, then goes down a little bit because people are getting them, and then maybe they're getting something better. But overall, all of these uniques here are totally good. They're being used. They have appropriate values to match their rarity. Nothing is of an atrocious rarity. The rarest thing is Doppelganger Disguise, And it turns out it's one of the most used ones at week 5, which is, again, makes sense. If it's rare and it's good, it should be used a lot because that's why it has the value. Then you get to Echo Forge, which has a less than 1% drop rate, costs basically nothing, except for as a collector's item. No one's fucking using them. That's a massive failure in design, in my opinion. Like, that's so strange that an item would be a 1% drop rate, right? This is being valued, drop rate-wise, as the same as Bottled Faith. You know, in week 1, 1,400 people using this, and 2 people using this. Granted, it has niche applicability to what it's used for build case-wise, but that, to me, is a failure of balance if it's not desirable to go for, to afford to use. It doesn't make any sense. So, that's a big wash. Jump to Uber Maven, a very similar story. Look at the loot distribution here, right? Viridi's Veil goes up to 850, then kind of plateaus and drops down. Why? Because people use them week 1 and week 2. That, when it hits the apex of use case, then people start to get better gear week 3, 4, 5. Start to goes down because less people are using them. Impossible Escape and Progenesis just fucking climbs, all right? 44% of the time when you kill Uber Maven, you're going to get Impossible Escape and Progenesis. They're going to be worthwhile as far as just the value of the unique in usage and its percentage compared to its rarity. In most cases, they're divines. The Progenesis is like 60 div, so... And there's 10,000 fucking people using them. 10% of the population are using Progenesis, right? So obviously success there. You go down to a 0.5 to 1% drop rate. Grace of the Goddess tells a very similar tale to Echo Forge. Absolute shit fest when it comes to balance. Totally missed the mark on design. Worthless item. No one's using them. No one's desiring to use them. Sometimes you see these spikes at week 3. This is like where people are trying stuff. They're saying, all right, 3 people use this week 1. No one's using it week 2. How bad can it be? And then you'll see as you get to week 3 and 4, there's not a huge swath of people then joining in the bandwagon because it's shit. So, very interesting there. Go down to Cirrus. Again, there's a similar tale, like, depending on what you're doing. Like, there could be this rise and then plateau of people using Hand of the High Templar because even in the best case scenario, it's kind of mid. Same thing with Crown of the Inward Eye. Goes up to 1,800-ish use case. Totally plateaus out, right? Because after weeks 2 through 5, the people that are using them, there's not new people using them because it's the people that are using it for the build. It's either best in slot, maybe getting a better corruption or a perfect roll, but for the most part, that's it. Similar to Burden of Truth, it goes down because it has the highest value in the beginning of League because it's not a very good unique as it scales over time relative to Trade League power. They just like Thread of Hope, that's just always been good and scales to the moon. 14% of people are using it. That's like a very large portion. Hard to denote whether this is small versus massive. However, I would imagine the vast majority of people who are running Thread of Hopes, I think, are using larges typically is the most common. So there's that. Uber Cirrus represented in a similar way of not knowing what threads, but Massive Thread is not the most desirable, but it is the most common. Tempest Rising being a 35% drop rate. Kind of a dud because it's less than 100% use case across 5 weeks. But Ori SN, extremely used item, extremely valuable item, and 9% fantastic. And Savior, although it's not as bad as Grace of the Goddess and Echo Forge, definitely doesn't reflect the same value when it comes to the sub 1% drop rate of one of the more difficult Uber bosses to have its thing used about 100 people at most, considering you have things like Rational Doctrine being the Uber variation for Venarius, upwards of 1,600 people. It's like not comparable. Elder is kind of a problem also when it comes to Disintegrator, the 1% drop. We'll jump around here. And it's like, the other ones are perfectly represented in a way. Mark of the Elder, Void Fletcher, not many, but some people. Shaper, again, similar thing. No one's using it over time. If the number doesn't scale up like a ramp, it's not that good because otherwise it would gain value as weeks progress, especially when it comes to builds, getting better and better. Indigon, however, fantastic. 4% drop rate, right? Quite rare. Not 1%, 4%. Huge difference, by the way, in 1% and 4%. I know it's only 3% apart, but this is now a 1 in 20 versus a 1 in 100. So not great. But yeah, but this is like thousands of people using it. Fantastic Disintegrator. Total failure of design. Not worth anything. No one's using it. Shouldn't be a 1%. Makes no sense. Uber Elder, Call the Void. Some people using it. Devour of Minds. No one's really using it. However, these are Devour of Minds is a new unique. I give it a pass. Something like Devour Minds was just added. It's not really that good because it's really doing something that is worse than a rare helmet, and it's also giving your minions charges based off of yours. Minion charge scaling was nerfed. It gives +1 minion all skill. Unfortunately, you can get up to +2 on a rare helmet. At the very least, if this roll just said 1 to 2, or dare I say, make it a 1 to 3, and then make that 30% drop rate, you know, swap that with Attorney Shroud's 9%, because no one's fucking using Attorney Shroud, right? If this was a 9% drop, but that roll said 1 to 3 minion skill gems, we got a unique on the table. That could be something worthwhile. You know, look at Soul Ascension, right? Week 1, not many people using it. Look at that escalation, right? It is a unique that is gaining value as builds progress, as players progress into week 5. To me, that's like super relevant. I also just realized I'm pretty sure I can right-click this and lock this somehow. View more actions, freeze up to row 1. Oh yeah, now I can scroll and it stays there. I'm not a wizard with sheets, but this is interesting to me. But yeah, so like Uber Elder for that, that's like there's no excuse for Disintegrate to be that bad. Devour the Minds, I could see balance occurring for that. Again, if you just swap that with Attorney Shroud, because no one's using Attorney Shroud. Like, this should be better in general, but literally if one person's using it the first week, you've kind of shit the bed. Void Forge rare, but sure there's some people using it, and Sublime Vision rare from this regular, you know, Uber Pinnacle Elder and Uber Shaper. However, there's a good representation of players there. Shapers is pretty interesting. Shaper is actually a great boss. Unrelated, Shaper's drop rates have not been data mined yet, as far as people running them. I guess there's not a lot of people are keeping track, but like tons of people are using Dying Sun, tons of people use Shaper's Touch, Void Walker not so much. Replica Void Walker is probably more common. We can actually check that real quick. I'd be curious based off of week 5 here. So you had Void Walker, week 5 snapshot is... Oh, sorry. Void Walker, week 5, 96 people. Replica Void Walker, 182. So literally twice as popular Void Walker is. So it's like very interesting that like that's the better one. But yeah, Solstice Visual being probably a 1 or 2%. Not represented too well, but anything in the hundreds I think is ultimately acceptable because people are still using it. Dying Sun and Shapers are like very used, so that's great. Then you get to Uber Shaper. The 50% drop rate on Uber Shaper is not used and did not escalate in usage realistically all league. That to me is kind of crazy, especially when you have the 35% drop rate being Tides of Time, extremely useful, and Tropic at 14%. So this is making up the other half of the drops basically. And then you have that being, you know, pretty useful. Why is this dud drop here? Like, that to me, that's a problem with the unique design and like imbalance. Like, that doesn't make sense. Wouldn't you rather have something like Echoes replace Shaper's Touch? Shaper's Touch is being used this common. Put that behind Uber. You know, incentivize people running it. Because it's like that unique is clearly, it's not just a starter unique that people are then dropping off on. It's escalation. It has an escalation of use case. It plateaus, but it's like, it's an escalation of use case. Even more so, Dying Sun. You can make Dying Sun the 9% drop, similar to Orias or Progenesis, and then push Echoes to the top and redistribute the percentages. Like, these to me are very obvious changes because it's just the numbers tell a very drastic tale. Starforge at 0.5. Batshit crazy. I don't know who did that. That weapon's basically unusable. You got a handful of penny people using that one. So very strange there. Exarch, look at that. This is what I recall. Obviously Dawn Strider at 100 is not great, but overall, pretty healthy boss. Nothing's in the double digits. To me, that's a success. Even more so, look at Uber Exarch. Again, a massive success in boss balance. Realistically, like, you have a distinct representation of each unique, an escalation of the uniques that have value, a minor de-escalation of plateaus of the uniques that had value in the early of the weeks and then progressed and kind of fell off a little bit. But overall, this is like, I think, a perfect representation of boss balance, right? Now let's go down one boss to Eater, the other side of the coin, and you could really show how much shitting the bed occurs here. So we don't know Eater's exact drop rates. You have the Gluttonous Tide, the Bow, and the Inexorable Fate, the Boots. They're either 30 or 55 in some split. I think the Boots are more common, so I think the Bow is actually the 33. But there was no one using it week 3. Talk about a failed unique. Like, this thing is literally not being used by people. In the hundreds, again, fine. Minor escalation plateauing occurring as far as usage goes, but it's like represented. And then melding, just look at that ramp up. It's a beautiful sight to see. 400 in week 1, 5,600 in week 5. That's unique. That is scaling with time at a 2% drop rate. That's fantastic, right? More being introduced in the game, more people can afford them. Searching for corruptions. You love to see that. Gluttonous Tide, total fucking flop. That has to be fixed because that is, if it's literally not being used by anybody, that's a problem. And then you have the Uber Eater version. And look at that. That is a beautiful success story of scaled cascading representation of uniques throughout the entire course of the league. You'll love to see people using uniques all week 1, 2, escalating up. Either things like Ashes plateauing a little bit, but Nimbus, more people afford them, more people can get them. Ravenous Passion, fantastic unique. So yeah, there's like, you know, to me, overall, the Uber Elder change as far as the access to them or the costs and things like that, I don't even care about, right? That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that a Unique's drop rate and a Unique's balance should be represented for its use case when it comes to a boss. If something's going to be a 1% drop rate or chase unique, by definition, it should be, if not financially valuable, just build enabling valuable, and the usage will be represented if that's the case, right? You have things like Crystallized Omniscience, which is by definition, a unique amulet that has a build enabling archetype with a stat scaling around it. It is used week 1, not as much as other amulets, but it is used week 1 and it scales over time. Melding of Flesh scales tremendously. Nimbus scales tremendously. Dissolution even has good representation, right? And it's not about it being the most common or uncommon drop, because you have the base drop of Dawnbreaker being a 33%, the same as Gluttonous Tide, I believe, is a 33% or something around that. And look at that representation when it comes to people using it. Its cost reflects it, and because it has a wide roll table, you get the feeling of someone who identifies it, and oh, I hit 20, I just made a mirror. You know, you don't get that in these other uniques. When it's the fucking Gluttonous Tide bullshit, or it's this Eternity Shroud, which has fallen from grace beyond belief. Devour Minds, again, I give that a pass. It's a new unique, but these aren't new. Disintegrator's not new. Eternity Shroud is not new. At this point, Gluttonous Tide is not new. Like Echo Forge, not new. There's kind of no excuse for uniques to be balanced so poorly, not only drop rate wise, but also usage wise, to the point where no one's using them. Basically, some people try them out and they say, wow, this is dog shit, and they move on. So this is not a plea for a change as much as it's just like to realize that this sort of stuff is happening, and it's interesting to chart it out, because you look at bosses, again, that are similarly represented, literally supposed to be like a brother-sister boss in like Exarch and Eater, and there is a clear success in execution when it comes to a drop like Dawnbreaker, and a clear failure in execution when it comes to a item like Gluttonous Tide. And it's not as if this is an anomaly for this league. Of course, you'd have to compare this sort of stuff to the the past league and the next league. Every league is kind of exists in a vacuum because it's based on the meta of that league. However, things like this really haven't changed. This has been shit forever and hasn't been used forever. This has been something similar. You know, it's been years since these things have been relevant. Years, literal years. So it's just interesting to look at. This is my TED Talk. That is it. I thought this was fun because I saw it and I was like, let me chart this out and get a full picture, because it is very interesting to see this out of a representative group of about 100,000 players at week 5, pulled from trade. And that's it. So I'll put this chart in the description. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that are be like, this isn't that, and that's not whatever. But like, these are the numbers. You can interpret them as you choose. This is how I'm interpreting them. And yeah, this is, I'd like to see these things rebalanced if possible, because it's quite unfortunate to see, you know, some of these things. And again, if it's a new unique, like Tempest Rising is, or like the Uber Elder Devour Minds, I give it a pass. But for these uniques of antiquity, there's a little bit of explain to do why that is dropping off of a literal cosmic deity. So that's it. I'm Mathew Lighty. This has been a little bit of slice of TED talking, and I'll see you guys in the next thing. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Bye bye.